All right, welcome, everyone. We are so delighted to have you here. We are so honored here in Utah to welcome the International Association of Religion Journalists who are coming to our city, many for the first time. And we want to thank the people who've made this all possible. The first person, of course, is Kem Gardner, who's here tonight. Thank you so much. And this is the Gardner Institute, and many of us have never been here, so it's beautiful. We would like to thank Sam and Diane Stewart Foundation. Diane is here also. Thank you. The Khosrow Samnani Family Foundation also gave us a lot of support, and they're not here tonight, but so I'm just going to read the other people who helped us out. The Orrin Hatch Foundation, Brigham Young University, which was terrific. Some of our international journalists spoke there in the last 2 days, and that was a great collaboration. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Clark and Christine Ivory Foundation, the Episcopal Diocese of Utah, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City, Dinesh Patel, Two Arrows Zen, and Sri Ganesh Hindu Temple. So let's give a great thanks for all the donors. I did want to take note, since we are all religion writers in our association, that today is Yom Kippur, which is a sacred day in the Jewish calendar, and we honor them, and we have learned a lot about this holiday. So take a moment and think about Yom Kippur as a special day of forgiveness and atonement. And now I would like to turn it over to our executive director, Endi Bayuni, who is going to say something about the organization.
Thank you, Peggy. Distinguished guests, friends, colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great honor and pleasure to extend the welcoming remarks to this exciting public lecture. Thank you for gracing your presence here tonight. The public lecture is now a regular feature of the IARJ conferences. Let me give you a brief introduction to the International Association of Religion Journalists. We were founded in 2012 in Bellagio, Italy. It's just as beautiful as Salt Lake City, by 24 journalists from representing countries from all corners of the world and representing all the major religions. Since then, our membership has grown to more than 600. We have an active website and social media platform churning out information about our activities and about the state of freedom of religion or belief around the world, some of them written by our own members. We have held many conferences since then, though not as many as we would like it to be. We had one in Bellagio in Italy, and then we went to Belo Horizonte in Brazil. And then we moved to Buenos Aires, Argentina. After that, we went to Dhaka, capital of Ghana, and then Jakarta, my hometown, in Indonesia. And then this year we have 3 conferences. First one was in Bali, that was back in March, and then in Warsaw, Poland in June, and Salt Lake City this week. You may notice that we know how to pick exotic places. Bali, Belo Horizonte, and Bellagio, and of course Salt Lake City. And thank you for taking us far, far away from the noises of Washington. This is a great place for us for a conference. The conference here is the inaugural North American meeting of the IARJ with a strong international flavor. So besides the North American journalists, we also brought some of the association members from different parts of the world, and two of them here will be speaking before us tonight, and there are a few others here in the room. Reporting religion is the hardest beat in any newsroom, and given the impact that our reporting has, it is also probably the most delicate and even more difficult now in an increasingly multi-phase environment with the tensions that comes with it. The IARJ conference is always the place where journalists who report on religion, we exchange stories on best practices. We have made it a tradition to hold a public lecture in conjunction with our conference to give the public a glimpse of the work that journalists who report and write about religion and about the religious communities. So we owe it to the audience to show how we work. These public lectures, I should add, are held in collaboration with the Association of Religion Data Archives, or ARDA, our partners since the beginning of the IARJ in 2012. Tonight, the topic of the public lecture is Understanding Religious Biases in Reporting on National and International Conflicts. And we have three distinguished speakers, a scholar, and two international journalists to share their stories with us. I'm sure you will enjoy listening to them. I know I will. Just a quick mention about our moderator tonight, David Briggs. Is a long-time religion reporter for the Associated Press. He was the one who came out with the initiative to establish the IARJ back in 2012, contacting the 24 journalists to come to Bellagio, an invitation that no one can refuse, including myself. The IARJ is David's brainchild, and he was also the founding executive director until 2016, and then I took over from him. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to David. Please give him a big applause.
Thank you, Andy. They finally got a good executive director. And we're so fortunate to have Andy, and really it was just a very small part of a wonderful group of people over the years, including your own beloved Peggy Stack. The theme of this year's conference is cultivating understanding, accuracy, and empathy in a polarized world. I think our public conversation this evening is a perfect example of the importance of this issue, and also will give you a specific understanding of issues regarding religious freedom and specific issues from the perspectives of journalists reporting on conflicts in those nations. The one thing, I'll introduce each of our guests, but the one thing I hope you will take from all of this is that we are all responsible for a more humble, peaceful world. Every one of us makes a difference, whether it's just the remarks we make in the store or how we act to other people in our community or in our profession. We can all make a difference, and I think the remarks of these prominent scholars and journalists will help us in our goal and our mission of that. Well, let me begin by introducing our first speaker. All of these are my great friends. Roger Finke, perhaps the best, most prominent scholar on religious freedom. He's done remarkable amounts of work on various aspects of religious freedom to find out why denials of religious freedom lead to conflict, and why countries that do have religious freedom and promote it in their culture, in their media, and and in their judiciary and in their government tend to thrive. So, excuse me. Roger Finke is professor of sociology and religious studies at Pennsylvania State University and director of the Association of Religion Data Archives. Roger is also a fellow of the Baylor Institute for Studies of Religion and a past president of the Association for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Culture. He is also a former president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion. His books are too numerous to mention, but they're seminal works on American religion and particularly on religious freedom globally. So please welcome Roger Finke.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, as David just said, I'm not a journalist. I greatly admire journalists and all that they do, and unfortunately I'm not one. Basically what I am is I'm a data nerd, and I collect a lot of data. Hopefully it's useful. As Mark Twain once said, data are like garbage. You want to make sure you know what you're going to do with them before you collect too much of it. And I've collected a lot of it. I hope that I put some of it to good use. What I'd like to review tonight with you is about the last 15 years, started collecting data on religious freedom, religious conflicts across the globe. Came up with some early findings. Since that time, other people have been adding to these collections, improving on these collections. And I want to just give an overview of this, but then I also want to close it up with why are journalists so important in this whole process too, and which I think they clearly are. And there are many things. In fact, one of the reasons initially David and I talked about him working with the Association of Religion Data Archives is it gives a whole new life to the research, to the data that scholars produce, which often just lies dormant and never gets noticed. So I really appreciate what David's doing. I appreciate what all of the journalists here are doing. And I'd like to review some of it. Some of this, for those of you who went to BYU, will be a review, but I eventually will get past that review. As we collected data, I knew that there certainly was religious persecution around the globe. I certainly knew there were restrictions on religion, but I was pretty much stunned, or certainly surprised at the very least, to find out how much. This is one of the first charts we put together when we first started working on this. It was on religious persecution. Now, with religious persecution, we wanted to be clear on what we were including. So as it says up here, it's the number of people who were physically abused, displaced from home, imprisoned, or killed due to religion. So this is not about simply being harassed. This is not about people simply saying bad things about you. This is about physical torture, physical abuse, or actually some sort of forced displacement. So we were surprised that 43% of the countries had more than 200 events or cases of physical persecution. So the question we wanted to initially address was why? What explains this level of religious persecution? We also did a number of measures on religious conflict, and there were really basically two explanations. There's one that's right, of course, that's mine. But there were basically two explanations as far as for why this occurred. The first one was by Samuel Huntington, where he explained to us that conflicts results when civilizations clash. And the civilizations are often identified with the major world religions. So he said these clashes occur in two ways. One is they occur within nations when you have religious pluralism and major world religions combine, or they meet, or across borders. And so he said this is the reason you have to be very cautious. In fact, he would suggest avoid this religious pluralism, avoid this clash of civilizations. A second explanation, which then I worked with Brian Grimm to really develop, was that it's not the clash of civilizations per se that causes the conflict. It's the response to those civilization divides. What we argued is the important element was the level of religious freedom, was the level to the extent that all religions were treated equal and that they all had equal access, equal freedom, and that was the argument we made. Now, we've tested this in many ways, and I'll save you from some of the charts I showed to the BYU crowd when they groaned. But here's just a very simple example. if you look at where there's severe interference with a basic religious freedom, such as the right to worship, you can see where there's more than 200 and some displaced, 80% of them had severe interference with the right to worship. It's a very strong relationship, but more importantly, when we controlled for a variety of other factors, that relationship held up. Okay? The government interference was really driving a lot of the religious persecution. Although we don't show it here, also, as I'll get into, societal pressures and restrictions were equally as important. Now, why? Okay, what explains this? Okay, well, one of the things that doesn't explain it is that it's not because constitutions don't promise freedom. In fact, if you look at the constitutions, over 90% of them promise religious freedom. And some people would argue as many as 95%. It's been coded up by different people, but they all are above 90%. Okay? At the same time, those promises of religious freedom are routinely denied. Okay? This is a chart put together by Dame Maddock for a publication we had. The blue line is the promises, the percent of the countries over time promising religious freedom. It's pretty much stayed exactly the same throughout all those time periods. There's a slight rise to the percent of countries with restrictions on religious freedom, but it's always been extremely high. And those restrictions can come in the form of legal codes. Sometimes these restrictions even come within the same constitution, but there can be all sorts of ways these restrictions are placed on countries. So what explains it? What explains this chasm is if you looked at most human rights. Okay, most human rights, this is explained as far as nations become more advanced economically, as educational standards increase, as income levels increase. That is not necessarily, those are not the best predictors for where religious freedoms really flourish. One of the key factors that really was driving government regulation of religion is societal pressures. And these societal pressures occur in a lot of ways. I mean, some are very formal pressures such as social movements, political movements, religious movements that are all targeting certain other religious movements. So there's certain pressure as far as on these groups. Some of this is open persecution, some of it is simply harassment. Second way is the local pressures and attitudes. Some of it's nothing more than just the attitudes that are have against minority religions, as far as the discriminating against them in jobs, employment, discriminating against them in education, or a variety of other ways. And then finally, the influence it has on national policies. So societal pressures is one of the big ones we found. And here are some of the, just one, this comes from Religion and State, a data collection which is collected by Jonathan Fox from Bar-Ilan University. And these are some of the different indicators he took, okay, to find out what percent of the countries had a threat of violence against people, harassment of religious members. And this is not something that only occurs in distant countries, for those who are from the United States. This is increasingly common in the United States as well. A second one, and this is probably the driving, number one force for government, is restricting through registration. Registrations become a powerful influence. They have the greatest impact on minority religions, but they impact as far as all religions. And with these registration requirements too, this is one more way societal pressures have an influence, because registration requirements tend to be implemented by local offices, local administrators that are very susceptible to the social pressures of these local areas. And finally, registration requirements are increasing, like religious violence, religious conflict, religious restrictions, it's increasing. Here is there a registration process that's different than other non-religious profits? You can see it's increased from 1990, from 73% to 89%. Down here, groups are officially required to register. The government enforces this and discriminates against unregistered groups. It's bumped from 22% to almost 40%. So this has continued to increase, and the registration requirements are often very subtle in what they require. I mean, because they're not noticed by the dominant religion. Sometimes they require religions exist for 25 years in the country or have a minimum of a certain percent of the population. And inevitably, they make it very hard for new religious groups to ever enter into the country. And by the way, too, even if there are no registration requirements, sometimes it still is very hard for religions to exist without registering. So for example, in France, it's something where you don't have to register, it's not required, but it's very hard to exist if you don't register. You can't open a bank account, you can't rent property. So these registration requirements have become a very subtle way of regulating these religions. Another one, as far as that really determines a lot of the government regulation of religion, is the governance. The independent judiciary, this was a major one that was covered at the conference here at BYU. The independent judiciary has a powerful impact, and especially powerful for minority religions, because minority religions, since they can't have the majority to be influential in legislative actions, they rely on the courts for protection. The second one, which is more the standard one we associate with democracies, is free, fair, and open elections. And these are associated with increased freedoms as well, but they serve the majority much better than the minority. And then finally, here you can see, as far as, again, these are not small differences. Where there's not an independent judiciary, the level of restrictions on religion are up to 89%, almost 90%. Where there are not free and fair open elections, it's 75%. So these are really substantial differences. Very, very major differences. At the same time, you see these positive effects. Democracy is not the panacea either, because free elections can unleash the tyranny of the majority, and especially through the ballot box. And we've seen that in a number of recent attempts to become democracies. Secularizing state can put a tension between secularism and religious freedoms. So we often think of secularizing the state, separating religion and state as a way to ensure that all religions are treated equal. But at the same time, sometimes the secular states are in competition with religious freedoms, sometimes very aggressively because they view religions as a threat, and sometimes simply because they have sort of their moral code of their own line of secularism they want to promote. And finally, democracies in certain countries have not proven as powerful in terms of securing religious freedoms. So here are just some quick key findings, and then I do want to talk more about how it affects journalists, or how journalists hopefully impact us. The restrictions on religion are high and they're rising. Religious freedoms serve to diffuse civilization divides. So the religious freedoms really help to diffuse when there's religious pluralism occurs. Okay? Make sure that everyone is treated equally. Increased religious freedoms are associated with the reduced registration requirements. That one's that's really the big one. Reduced societal pressures, again, a very powerful one that varies from one culture to the next. The independent judiciary and the free, fair, and open elections. And the consequences of religious freedom, which are the ones that I really want to stress. So the consequences are increased religious discrimination. When religious freedoms are denied, there's increased discrimination and increased persecution and social religious conflict. Okay, so now so we have these very clear findings. Okay, so it's pretty simple. It's really should have religious freedoms and everyone would live happier thereafter. But why? Why aren't they? Well, one of the reasons is most people are unaware. Okay, they're unaware of a number of things. One, when we do surveys, when you ask people, do you have religious freedom in your country? Well, yes. The vast majority of people say, well, yeah. You know, there's churches all over, or there's mosques all over, or there's temples all over. So yeah, we have religious freedom. And they also will point to the freedoms of the Constitution. You know, it's guaranteed in our Constitution that we have freedom. And they will even point to support provided for religion. When I taught in China one summer, and I met with a Religious Affairs Bureau from a variety of different areas around the country, one of the first things they would point to is, we believe in religion. And in fact, one of them was very pointed, he says, we know atheism doesn't work, even though they're still trying to enforce it pretty strictly. But we know so that's why we even want to support religion. We want to provide support for them, and they do, for the Three Self movement churches or churches or religions. And then finally, and I think this is a key one that was emphasized this morning or early this afternoon by a number of journalists, is a lot of people know very little or nothing about religious groups. Okay, when I teach social religion to undergraduates, and I often start off the course by saying, well, you know, tell me more about why you took the course and what your experience or what your knowledge is about religion. And I had one, very kind young woman said, you know what? She says, I took this course because I know almost nothing about religion. The only thing I know about religion is they hate women and they hate gays. I said, well, there's a little more to it. So, yeah. So, clearly, a lot of times there is a lack of knowledge in these areas. Now, another reason, as far as that they deny religious freedoms despite the potential benefits of them, is oftentimes these groups are seen as a security threat. Okay, and you see this very evident as far as why some groups are discriminated more by the government than others. Now, I'll give you one example, but there's a number of complicated examples. In Europe, if you look at the societal discrimination, Jews and Muslims receive pretty much equally negative treatment in terms of with societal discrimination. But if you look at government restrictions, then it's far more on against Muslims. Okay, now a big part of that's a security threat. A part of it also is European history, but there is really a difference as far as between different groups are treated by the government to the extent they're perceived as a security threat. Unlike other human rights, too, religion is organized into organizations which allows them to mobilize support in far more effectively than a lot of other human rights do. So they become much more of a threat to the government. And again, when I was talking to people from the Religious Affairs Bureau, I said, we want to support religion, but we also want to keep it under control because we know it can be dangerous. So it's clearly seen as a threat too. Another one is, and this one doesn't need a lot of explanation right now, is a lot of people perceive these religions as the minority religions as foreign religions. Okay, and it's very negative and again a great threat. Okay, and obviously this can occur at every level. Finally, a moral threat. And this is a moral threat in a couple different ways. But moral threat as far as because one religion challenges the morality of another religion, or the morality as far as across those with no religion. And then, which really leads up to the next one, the threat to the secular state. Every state has a moral code. Okay? It's a matter of what do you base the moral code on, and to what extent do these minority religions threaten that moral code in some way, or does the state's code threaten the minority religion? So there's a number of reasons why there's still a tendency or a justification why the state would still justify supporting denial of religious freedoms. Now, how does this apply to journalists? Okay, here I'm going to pose some things, but I don't blame you if you say, oh, he's so naive. One is, and this is, the journalists tell the story. And I don't think, well, I think you do realize, that's why you went into journalism, how powerful that is, okay? Is being able to tell the story and tell the story effectively. Working with David, I was always amazed when he would report on my research, and then I'd say, wow, that really sounds interesting. Yeah, So, yeah, being able to tell that story and tell it effectively and how it applies to people's lives, that's important, okay? And the other thing is being able to tell the story for the outgroups, okay? The religious minorities. And sometimes the outgroups are even people we don't think of as outgroups, okay? Sometimes people don't understand conservative religion, for example. Conservative evangelicals, they don't understand conservative Catholics. So it doesn't even have to be a tremendous outgroup to really say they aren't understand. So I think an important one is to help those who are misunderstood. And I think that really is a tremendously important one for all of us. Another one is you tell the story in real time. Sociologists sometimes have really good in-depth qualitative studies, okay? And if you're willing to wait 5 to 10 years, it's really good, okay? But as Rod Stark, my frequent co-author, would always say, because he was started out as a journalist, he said, it's just slow journalism is all it is, And so, fortunately, you have deadlines that may force you to write much quicker than that, so you get to hear the story in real time. And it's really an important one. I think that I always am using it as a reference group, the academics, okay? And I think also journalists have a much greater impact as far as on the societal pressures. Here, David and I also are familiar with the Pew Research Center here in the United States, but they're ones who really work hard to have an impact as far as beyond the academy. What David did did the same thing. And then finally, and I think this kind of overlaps with the other ones I've been talking about, is to help to develop a better understanding of religious groups and those in conflict with these groups. And I think here is where there's so much misunderstanding on both sides. Just something as simple as providing of social services. Why is that important to some religious groups to be able to provide that? Why would it be important for them to provide services for their own, or educational services for their own religious group? What challenges does that pose to the state? A big one right now in the United States is LGBT versus a lot of religious conservatives. In what ways do they threaten each other's human rights? And in what areas do they not threaten each other's human rights? And how can this be worked out? And actually, Utah is one of the leaders in the United States for actually working that out better than most. But I think it's really important to tell the story for both sides, so both sides can understand each other. And both sides can understand that they're not necessarily just against each other, but they each have something that's important to each other. Another one is simply things such as diet, health, medical care. All of these things are areas that if you have a better understanding of the group, it really helps as far as with being willing to accommodate certain groups, being willing to work with them. In the United States, the Amish are ones that often get a lot of accommodation, but there's a whole lot of groups that don't. And so I think that's an important one. And then finally, the relationship to other human rights. And this is really a crucial one. Because on the one hand, when we do this research, all human rights, it's like all boats rise together. But a lot of these boats see themselves as being in conflict with each other. And so how do you respect the rights, the dignity of all of these groups, and help them to see, to work together on this? And I think, again, I think journalists helping to getting that story out, getting it out quickly, getting it out as these events are occurring is something that no one else is doing. And as you talked this afternoon about the concern of fewer and fewer journalists, for me that's a major concern. Because this is, I think, not only important, but it's essential right now. And essential for this. I'm just going to close with the same closing I had at the BYU is the upshot of all of this is that when religious freedoms are uniformly secured for all, the freedoms for even the smallest minority become the freedom for others. The story I told there too is when I was interviewing an imam in the Detroit area, and he told me the story. He says, yeah, we tried to rent this space at a shopping mall, and he said they wouldn't rent it to us because they didn't want to have Muslims in the shopping mall, you know, because it was a strip mall, was really what it was. And he said, but the Protestant ministers and other clergy came to our defense and said essentially their freedoms are our freedoms, and they have every right to rent space just as we would. And he was so impressed with that. But I think that is the important lesson. Is when your freedoms are my freedoms, which is the closing one. I have motivation to support your religious freedoms when your freedoms are my freedoms, and that's what I hope more people do for each other. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Roger, sir. That was wonderfully concise argument, giving us lots of thought for each of us, and particularly the journalists. Our next speaker is Indiwari Amawate. Indiwari is head of news for Colombo-based Ada Dharana English on Sri Lanka's only 24-hour news channel, Ada Dharana 24. She's also the host of the talk show at Hyde Park, a current affairs program. Indiwari, one of the founders of IARJ in 2012, is currently working on stories to understand the radicalization of Sri Lankan youth and countering violent extremism. Please welcome Indiwari Amawate.
Thank you everyone for inviting me here. Thank you IARJ. Thank you to the sponsors for making it possible this evening. I thought I'll tell you my story. To begin with, On the 23rd of March this year, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, he announced what he described as the complete eradication of Islamic State after the fall of the group's last stronghold in Syria. Fast forward a month, almost a month, on the 21st of April this year, my country was targeted. It was a lazy Sunday morning for me. Finally, I had taken a day after a long assignment of 9 days. I wake up to a string of messages on WhatsApp. It was close to 9 a.m., only to see bloody images inside a very familiar church. Although I instantly recognized the structure of the building, I was not sure what I was looking at. That's how most of us in Sri Lanka woke up that morning. To give you an idea of Sri Lanka's population, we are at 21 million people, of which 70.2% are Buddhists, 12.6% Hindus, 9.7% Muslims, and 7.4% Christians. Images of the Kochikade church, which is in Colombo, that were being circulated, the St. Anthony Shrine, that is, which was not just a Roman Catholic church, but a place of worship that had acquired a reputation among a wider population, from Buddhists to Hindus, as a miracle worker. Regardless of their religion, they sought blessings from this church. I could not believe what I had before my eyes, still half asleep and in shock at the sight of those disturbing images. Then I received a second batch of pictures, another bloody sight. I could not tell where it was, but I definitely knew it was from Sri Lanka. Several quick phone calls were enough to realize that there had been some explosions at several sites in Colombo, the commercial capital of Sri Lanka. I didn't want to believe that my beautiful country, which spent decades attempting to end a brutal war with terrorists, had been thrust back to those dark times. This was a similar feeling among all Sri Lankans again. We enjoyed a peaceful country where all cultures, ethnicities lived in harmony, and from the very outset, I couldn't help but suspect that we had become the victim of a terrorist attack. At the moment, it was still a suspicion, and there was no confirmation. The country's decades of war was something the whole country, Sri Lanka, the island nation, shut its collective minds to, with no conceivable desire to relieve. But were the terrorists back? This was the question every single phone caller had for me. For the first time in a long time as a reporter, I did not have any answer to any of those questions. What was this? What were the images? Now, these questions were far too many, and the journalist in me overpowered the emotional citizen. I rushed out of bed, headed to the studios in Colombo, knowing that the epicenter of these attacks, of these explosions, were where I was headed to. Constantly making phone calls while driving, I had to liaise with correspondents and assign reporters and camera crew as rumors were circulating, making it very difficult to identify facts. As I drove with a few reporters, just a few yards ahead, another explosion happens. It was very difficult. I still remember being behind the wheel when a confirmation of yet another terrorist attack happened, and the Shangri-La Hotel, a newest investment to the fast-developing city of Colombo. Shangri-La Hotel was also the site of an explosion. And for the first time, suicide attack was mentioned with conviction. Who did this? Are the terrorists back? They were the questions I kept pondering over. And as we were trying to fact-check when I was back at the studios, verify and speak to the police about what had happened, news of other explosions, as I said, came to light. Sri Lanka had incidentally marked 10 years of hard-fought peace just 3 days before the 21st of April. That was very difficult for the entire nation. I quickly got on set to break the unfortunate news, but of course, people had seen uncensored, the most graphical, unedited images, and also live streamed on social media, so they were aware of what was going on. They had already seen the bloody images, bodies in pieces, what I had already woken up to that morning. We had to be very careful in giving information out to the public, and we did not We did so only when we received confirmation from police and trustworthy sources from the locality. This was a decision we took instantly because people were already confused with the influx of social media messages and pictures and rumors flooding their news feeds. As we were constantly updating the unfolding situation, it emerged that 2 other luxury hotels in Colombo were the target. To compound matters, we received confirmation that 2 other churches were also attacked and were the target of the terrorists. Despite rumors of a terrorist attack being thrown about, as the time ticked by, it became apparent it was a concerted and coordinated effort and attack. All the explosions happened between 8:45 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. Now, the mood of the studio, of the reporters, journalists, the cameramen, was simply disbelief. For 30 years, Sri Lanka battled to end the most brutal terrorist organization in the world, and on Easter Sunday, all the raw emotions felt during that time came flooding back. As our broadcast went on for hours with our channel, Adadarana 24, being the only 24-hour news channel in the country, we had the responsibility of keeping people updated as quickly as possible on the truth about what happened, and also with social media being at the fingertips of most people, it was essential that we do so with utmost diligence and sensitivity. Not only that, since the broadcast was continued in English, the eyes of the entire world was upon us. At a time, I remember we did not want to break news and be ahead of the game to report first, but we took time, a lot of time, to send in updates. Other than relating what was seen firsthand, we made sure no commentaries or speculating reports were allowed. In the afternoon, more bad news reached us. 2 minor explosions were reported from a guest house and a house. The government blocked major social media networks and messaging services such as Facebook, WhatsApp, followed by an indefinite island-wide curfew. Of course, the social media sites, the ban was only for those who did not have access to VPN. Everyone had access to VPN, so mobile penetration in Sri Lanka is very high. Less than a week after the attack, in fact, the very next Friday, as security operations were launched in Batiklo on the eastern coast of Sri Lanka, after a shootout, a suicide blast during the operation, 15 people, including 6 children and 3 women, were found dead. Now, this was a terror training center. The death toll following these attacks were initially placed at 359, but several days later it was revised down to 253. The Sri Lankan government faced some criticism over the sizable discrepancy, but the health authorities who were in charge of this task had their fair share of difficulties. They were attempting to ascertain the death toll by analyzing body parts in most cases. And mind you, 500 injuries were reported too. More than 2 days after, until the Islamic State took responsibility for the coordinated efforts, it took 2 days for them to take responsibility. And among the victims were not just Sri Lankans. We had several foreign nationals, billionaires, tourists, and Sri Lankan origin children who had come to visit their family here. And as we look at these images, Sri Lanka was, like I said, there were foreigners and 9 suicide bombers, 8 men and 1 woman who was pregnant. She killed 3 policemen when they moved to arrest her. And they were responsible for the attacks, and 2 of them, children of millionaires who grew up in luxury. Several of the bombers had studied abroad, and their career prospects seemed nothing but bright. Research has shown that this is nothing unusual, that roughly 70% of global recruits for Islamic State were middle class or wealthier. And with the new expansion, with the expansion of IS into our part of the world, with them setting up caliphates in several parts of our region, this has proven more and more. For the first time in Sri Lanka, the aftermath of the horrific massacre saw more violence, with ordinary citizens reacting in anger, putting their emotions out, and for the lack of responsibility for comments made by certain politicians and religious leaders. There was general opinion within the country that the securities apparatus had been destabilized following the end of the conflict. And the influence of the West in matters of the island nation had taken a toll on national security. That was the sentiment. People were angry with the government for being too liberal and for allowing Western interference, while some politicians, alluding to caches of swords found hidden inside several mosques during subsequent raids, as those used to clear shrubs and prune bushes, added to the anger and then the hatred. And soon the backlash turned into violence. There were two people I interviewed. One said, "I feel like going and killing those Muslims." Said a mother who lost her entire family. We kept the voice cut out. And then another said, "My friends and family died at the church. I would do anything to massacre those barbarians." We left that voice cut out too. But what did the international media do? Just as much as social media had a massive role to play in the ensuing violence and vandalism. International media's portrayal of communal violence in Sri Lanka added to the growing tensions. It is understood that fact-checking and relating stories in a faraway island is difficult, but Sri Lanka had suffered far too much for far too long. And it was not the time for experimenting, storytelling based on unverified information. None of the positive stories were featured. I would like to show a report that we had. I'm not sure if it'll take too long, but this was something that we featured on our television station so that we could counter most of the violence that was ongoing. Just bear with me, I'm trying to get there. I'm not used to PowerPoint. Okay, I think I'm there. Now
Churches across Sri Lanka suspended Sunday Mass as security concerns remained high a week after suicide bombers killed over 250 in churches and hotels across the island nation.
Churches such as these have been kept in lockdown or are secured by the police force. And as you can see behind me, signs and notices have been placed that services have been cancelled for the day. And as the entire country mourns for the death of those who have lost their lives.
Meanwhile, Buddhist clergy held a walk from Sri Sambuddha Loka Mahaviharaya to Kingsbury Hotel this morning. Thereafter, a religious ceremony was held at the hotel in memory of victims of the Easter Sunday attack. In Gangaramya Temple, religious observances were held in memory of those who lost their lives in the attacks under the auspices of President Maithripala Sirisena and Auxiliary Bishop of Colombo, Father J.D. Anthony Jayakodi today. Meanwhile, religious observances were also held at the Asgiri Raja Mahaviharaya in memory of the victims. Religious observances were held at the Malwatu Dalukgolla Mahaviharaya with the participation of the Catholic community in the area. A memorial service who lost their lives in the Easter Sunday attack was held with the participation of the Buddhist, Catholic and Muslim community in Katukurun, the Kalutara.
We feel that the bombing last week was a terrible attack on the beautiful country of Sri Lanka.
So that was how we wanted to give a positive angle to what was going on, with most reports alluding to tensions between communities, but it was actually statements made by politicians, religious leaders that led to this violence. And international media picked up on a decade-long war when this had nothing to do with the tensions during the 3 decades that Sri Lanka had experienced. So I'd like to leave at that, and I'd like to take up any questions you want. I think I've taken more time than I should. Thank you very much.
And emotional and touching personal reflection as well. It really brought home what happened to each of us. Oh, is Uday Basu. Uday is the coordinating editor of The Statesman, a leading English language daily published in India's major cities. Founded in 1875, The Statesman has a Sunday circulation of 230,000. Uday leads a network of reporters across the country. He also writes on political, religious, social, economic, and cultural issues. He is the author of Left Out in Bengal, which traces the rise and fall of the Marxist government in the state of Bengal, whose 34-year rule ended in 2011. Please welcome Uday Basu.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege and great honor for me to be invited to speak before you and share some of my thoughts on this current topic. After this brilliant exposition by our Professor Finke, who has turned out to be a real doctor of religion, my presentation will perhaps appear like that of a quack. But even then, let me try. See, journalists are essentially soldiers of truth, and it is their bounden duty to wield their pen in the cause of truth. We believe in the maxim, truth must prevail. There is a constant conflict between truth and falsehood. And journalists worth the salt take up the cudgel that is their pen to make sure truth is not supplanted by falsehood. It is a protracted and often dangerous battle. When it comes to religion journalism, the battle is many a time fraught with grave dangers. The reason is, religion journalists are dealing with high voltage passion, where thousands of people are propelled by some belief, philosophy of life, they would defend with their lives if needed. Now, how should religion journalists function when addressing dangerous conflicts and help restore peace, amity, sanity, and balance? The dangers are far greater now in this age of internet and social media than what they were in the age of typewriter, telex, and trunk call. Let me share with you two of myriad such experiences of mine in this age of electrifying electronics and also in the age of typewriter, because I have been in this business for quite some time. So I have seen both the wars of the media. Well, the first thing, it happened in my state, Bengal, recently. India is now experiencing an unprecedented religious conflict between majority Hindus and minority Muslims. More than religion, unfortunately, it has to do with capturing political power in order to grab economic resources. This is the genesis of this conflict. A skewed version of Hinduism is being used to stoke communal passion and thereby garner votes to rule the country. The Hindutva group, the BJP, has met with a stiff resistance from a left-of-the-center political party ruling in the province of Bengal. Incidentally, Bengal has huge economic resources, and it is a gateway to Northeast India and Southeast Asia. For this reason, the BJP is desperate to capture Bengal. In fact, its national president, who is also the Home Minister, has said on umpteen occasions that the BJP's expansion is incomplete unless and until they can capture Bengal. Bengal is so important, mainly for these economic reasons. Now, the way to do this, to capture Bengal, is to whip up communal passion of the Hindus against the Muslims. With that objective in mind, a riot was engineered in a semi-rural area of Bengal, not far away from Kolkata. We were getting reports of arson, attacks, and destruction of houses with tiled roofs. But the press was not temporarily allowed to visit the scene of trouble, as the social media had added fuel to fire, with horrific, distorted accounts hurting the sentiments of the minority population. There were reports of the majority community bearing the brunt of the mayhem. Now, I decided to send a Sikh reporter of mine to the spot. He is neither Hindu nor Muslim, and as such, acceptable to both. He was stockily built, with a massive frame, as Sikhs generally are, unlike my slight figure. I told him to just ignore the police and tell them, if challenged, that he resided in one of the affected villages. He should take that cover in order to penetrate the interiors of the village. He had such a massive figure with a turban on top that the police on duty must have got scared, especially since he didn't deign to look at them as I had tutored him. The pose worked. He could visit the interior villages and got authentic details of the communal frenzy, the first true accounts done by the media. We could show with pictures how both the communities harmed each other, and the truth was, it was not an act of one single religious group. Most of the media, especially those based in the capital of India, Delhi, had been propagating that the minority Muslims had run amok, as they have virtually become puppets of the BJP. But my paper doesn't believe in prostituting our pain. So I could, with the help of my intrepid Sikh reporter, portray the truth and douse the communal passion. We also told our readers how a sinister attempt had been made to deliberately instigate communal strife through falsification of the life story of a religious preacher with the help of the social media, morphing the image of the leader. My decision to send a Sikh colleague to the spot was a masterstroke, enabling me to unravel the truth and help restore peace and douse communal passion. So that was the recent case. Now let me go back to the age when the telex and teleprinter reigned supreme. And in that case, I myself went to the spot. Now I tell you what happened. I went to a remote village in Bengal where 17 innocent people lost their lives after their bodies were riddled with police bullets. The police had to resort to firing to quell the communal violence. It was sparked by a Tazia procession that was moving across a Hindu-dominated area in the same village. Now the procession cut off a branch of a tall tree that was obstructing the movement of the Tazia. In the heat of the moment, they forgot to take the permission of the Hindus. a bloody clash ensued, and the police opened fire to separate the warring groups. When I reached the area the next day, the sun had already set, but the lingering amber light still kept the darkness away. In that twilight zone, I first entered the part of the village where the Hindus lived, talked to them to get their version of the story, and then moved into the Muslim area. The Muslims were very hostile, as they had seen me talking to the Hindus. They were angry and asked me why I hadn't come to them first. Temper was rising, but I retained my cool and adopted a blow hot, blow cold attitude to show to them I wasn't scared by them, though I was really scared. That is very important to keep a hostile mob at bay and do our job of garnering as much information as possible. So I told them how they could be so foolish not to have realized I had to cross the Hindu area before I could reach them. Simple. Moreover, had I been partisan, I would have gone away after getting the Hindu version. Since I had come to know the truth, I was meeting them. That had instant effect on the mob. The Sena persons among them pacified the hostile crowd and started telling their version of the trouble. I knew I had also to win their trust and confidence as well. So I asked them if they could give me a glass of water, as I was very thirsty. That was part of my trick anyway. They were stunned and looked at one another. We are Muslims and you are a Hindu. Would you drink water from us? One of them mustered courage to ask me. I pretended to be angry with them and told them, look, this is your problem. You don't know how to treat a human being as a human being. Both Hindus and Muslims drink water when they're thirsty, and water has no religion. Whatever your religious belief, I have no hesitation in accepting you as my brothers and the senior ones as my uncles. That was again a masterstroke. They opened up and gave me their version. Before I left, I told them they must realize that 17 lives have been lost for a small thing, that is, cutting a branch of a tree. Had they simply approached the Hindus and told them about their problem, they would have themselves cut off the branch and let the procession go on unhindered. This is exactly what the Hindus had told me half an hour ago. The Muslims nodded. The long report I dispatched from my hotel room explained all this, and that was my humble attempt to help find a solution to dangerous conflicts. My belief in the welfare of mankind, nurtured by the religion of love and compassion, preached by Lord Krishna, Jesus Christ, Lord Buddha, Prophet Muhammad, and other spiritual giants, is the guiding principle of my work as a religious journalist and my chart and compass to navigate through life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uday. A beautiful reflection. And well, once again, thank everyone who is here today. Thank you. We're so grateful that you all came to join us in this conversation. And well, now is the time for questions when we all become part of the conversation. So may I ask if who would like to ask the first question? Oh, Raj, thank you.
This is where I'm getting interested.
Oh, sure, okay. Thank you for your excellent presentations. I thought all of them were very informative and insightful. I just had a quick question for the data on, is there any countries or regions where you're seeing a decrease in religious freedom, or are there any countries that are getting better, or is it overall getting worse? Or?
The general trend is clearly getting worse. The areas that are the highest are, South Asia. That area is extremely high and has been high, and there's little variation because it's kind of at its extreme already. There are not a lot of areas showing a sharp decline. Now, South America has been quite low, and is, for the most part, maintained being low. Africa has varied much more than most regions. And in Europe, we've seen some increases there, in part related probably to immigration issues as well. So not a lot of, I wish I had some encouraging news to give, but I don't have a lot, no.
So, Indy, I was so interested in a couple of things. I mean, everything you said, but a couple of things really stood out. One is your decision not to go quickly with rumors online. I do think some of our colleagues in the industry want to always be first, even if they can't confirm things. So talk a little bit more about that decision, and also how do you combat rumors on social media and fake news? How did you do that, being on air for 24 hours?
Certainly, thank you, Peggy. It was a very challenging time for us, a 24-hour news channel, and everything's based on ratings. You have more people watching, you have your sponsors coming in. That's how it works. But with more and more people tuning in to find out what was happening, we already knew that people had seen what they had to see, what had happened. The decision that we took to make sure we took as much time as possible to broadcast and to go live and to break the news was because we didn't know ourselves what was going on, first, and secondly, we didn't want to speculate. Yes, we had a terrorist attack, and like I said, to me personally, I was wondering whether the terrorists were back. That's exactly what all of Sri Lanka was thinking about, because that's all we knew. And let me remind you, during the time of the terrorist insurgency in Sri Lanka, South Asia was familiar with the situation, but the West was not. They did not recognize Sri Lanka's situation until the 9/11 attacks. That is when the entire world came together with Sri Lanka as a country. And so this time, with the Easter attacks, 10 years after peace, during a period of reconciliation, we had to ensure that we did not speculate or move into commentaries. Whereas international media, we saw some of the biggest stations talking about what may have happened, who may have attacked Sri Lanka, which led to a lot of issues within the country, because people were already watching those. We have cable TV in Sri Lanka, so everyone subscribed to these. That was a decision I took to ensure that we do not move into any telecast as such. But you asked me about fake news. a reason why the first spate of violence, vandalism, occurred was because of an accident between two random motorists. One happened to be a Muslim young person, a youth, and the other a Sinhalese. And unfortunately, it happened after the Easter attacks. But the reason why that accident developed into a nationwide conflict, and which was portrayed as violence between two religious groups, was because of the media again, which is why we had to be very careful on how we report. Does that answer your question?
How do you address the social media?
Social media. So with social media, we made sure that we had our own social media sites ongoing, and we gave facts. We made sure we counted also, because sometimes there were reports about, they would say, a bomb, an explosive device was found in this part of town, that part of town. So we were on air throughout the day, 24 hours. And we kept addressing the situation as it updated. And we made sure we told our people that what was happening, the truth as it unfolded. And that also brought most of our viewers together instead of resorting to social media, because they knew that certain other devices which were on Twitter, we saw many people tweeting about bullets, etc., which were from the terrorist period, pictures taken back then. So we had to counter them as and when these tweets were shared on social media. But it was a very challenging period, especially for us broadcasters too, because it was important that we verify with our police and sources on the ground and people who are trustworthy before we go on air, even to counter these, because we might make a mistake, you never know. And once it's on the news, you can't take it back. Once the damage is done, you cannot reverse it. So it was important that we not only tell the truth, but also be responsible citizens and have empathy towards the victims. And also, even when it came to the terrorists, I believe this was my experience, if I may add, during the conflict when I interviewed former cadres. It was very important that you carefully interview them, because they are also victims. You do not victimize the victims. It was very important because they had gone through so much to be radicalized, to be suicide bombers, to have that will to go to kill and die for a cause. And it was very important for me also when you talk about terrorists and not name them terrorists, but see them as victims at the same time.
Sorry. Very quick question for Mr. Finke. I did not know, and I'm very thankful that you're maintaining a database of. What is the input to your database? Is it just news reports, or do you do data collection, or how is this set up?
Right. We would, yeah, the archive I keep talking about, the Association of Religion Data Archives, it's at the URL, it's thearda, so thearda.com. And we have over 1,000 different data collections. Now, many of our data collections are U.S. surveys, but we also have been working very hard to develop more cross-national surveys. Some of them we've produced ourselves. Most of them we've gotten from international scholars to input. In addition to that, what we do is we have national profiles. So for each nation, we will have summary data on, like, say, the breakdown of religious adherence, some socioeconomic measures, independent judiciary, not independent judiciary. And then if they were a part of the World Values Survey, you get to see some summary information on them. So we have, and then we also have mapping too. Everybody loves mapping. So you can map out by region or by country and then use a variety of different variables that way. So what we've attempted to do is we have the data archive, which is used more by researchers, but then we try to provide some online tools that people who are not researchers can use as well too. So we've tried to have both. Now, in addition to that, then we have the press room, which David has been in charge of for a long time, and there is where he would have his biweekly columns and would have what he refers to as Global Plus, where he does special features, which I think some of the people here have been parts of. Yeah.
Feeding.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, so, yeah, and so that's some of the features we have there. And it's now 17.5 million static pages of content, and then hundreds of millions more you can generate interactively. So it's gotten quite out of hand.
Thank you. The second part of my question was for Mr. Basu. What you spoke of was social or passionate individual causes and how they can be diffused or propagated. But what when the government itself picks up? For example, I come from a state of Tamil Nadu where the government univocally declared they will administer all Hindu temples. They did not touch other faiths because they were rich and they needed the money. But there was never a big protest against this by either the churches or the others. And I'm not sure if the economics plays a big part in somebody grabbing a religious organization.
Absolutely, it's happening. The government sponsoring religious groups or religious bodies, it is happening, and the media is playing I must say, a section of the media, because a majority of them have sold themselves out, but a section of them are hammering. They are going hammer and tongs against these governments and calling a spade, because that is not the work of a government. A government can act as a facilitator, but cannot promote any religion. This is against the Constitution of India. And whenever governments violate these constitutions, the government in my state also violated this constitution by granting donations to Muslim clergy. We also went hammer and tongs against the government, and thereafter it changed its policy in Bengal. But in Tamil Nadu, it's a different case, a different ballgame altogether. And the Hindu group is taking it up, but it's a lone voice over there.
Oh,
he shot first.
Okay.
So, related to government and religion's accruing power and influence, in the history of humanity and in different parts of the world, as a religion is a majority religion or gains influence, many religions aren't democratic and tend to prefer secrecy to transparency, and often the leaders of the religion may not practice the very doctrines the religions promulgate. Is there a role for journalists to bring more transparency and call these leaders to account through information, or is it just too dangerous?
I'll say yes.
See, there are so many examples I can cite. We don't have the time to catalog all those details. Yes, whenever religious teachers, preachers deviate from what they preach, we do call them into account. Right now, in India, the media, of course this a section of the media, is after one such imposter who belongs to a religious order, but who became a minister, a central minister, meaning became a minister of the government of India. And now he is a mentor of a chief minister of a state. Now he is the owner of a law college, and he uses the students, the girl students, as his objects of lust. He blackmails them. He gets pictures of the students when they have their bath and exploit them. This has been going on for quite some time. Now the media have exposed them, and he is now in jail. But of course, this government is going out of its way to defend this monk by diluting the charges against him. But we are after them. We won't spare them that way.
I have a question. It seems to me that there's a reductionism that's going on constantly to try to say, well, it's only an economic problem, it's only an educational problem, and yet your research shows that at least number two is this what you tend to call a social issue. And I remember, good old Tocqueville said that it ain't the laws of a country that matter, it's the mores. People don't care deeply about the laws. They, as you've shown, they just break them if the mores support that. And so my question is, are you finding any effective ways at getting to the deeper mores? Are people actually trying to change the cultural mores, or the way the religions, in other words, teach how to deal in conflict, versus everybody should be peaceful? That's crazy, right? But how do they teach to deal? And that's the mores of conflict to me are very interesting.
Go ahead.
Just to add, to supplement to his question,
Yeah.
is as a doctor, you have diagnosed the disease. Now let us give us the remedy.
Give you the remedy, okay. Yeah, I don't know that I have the remedy, but what I can say is that the one thing that is clear as far as when you reduce the natural flashpoints, when you reduce when they're competing over, like, say, financial goods, political power, because that's one of the key things as far as when you start to sort out, because people are going to act for political power, or when you have a close relationship in church, religion, and state, they will do that. So I think trying to just systematically go through and reduce those flashpoints, trying to reduce where there's going to be a competition for resources, where there's going to be a competition based on their ethnicity or based on their religion or some combination thereof. I think those are the things to try to avoid, to make sure that equality remains. Now, in terms of changing their attitudes about the other group, completely, I don't know that that can be changed fully. However, if they're not pitted against each other, I think that goes a long ways towards reducing the boundaries, at least the tensions on those boundaries.
Could I add something to that, please? Something that worked in Sri Lanka during the 1950s, the education system policy. We had comparative religion as a subject, mandatory subject. You start at a very young age, but that was replaced by what you call national schools, and schools that represent either Buddhist, Muslim, or Catholic schools, which is why we are experiencing this. So I believe education is the answer, and there too, comparative religion, that takes you a long way.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay. I'm sorry. Well, how about two quick questions? I didn't want to neglect this side of the room.
Okay. I have to admit I'm a lot more interested in what has taken place tonight than I thought it would be. But anyway, on your statistics, I've been working with the Karen and Karenni community that is here in Salt Lake, and there's really quite a few of them. I don't know how familiar you are. They're from Burma, or currently Myanmar. And your statistics, really, I don't know if they clearly demonstrated, but what you just said was interesting, because a lot of times the displacement of refugees has a lot to do with natural resources and economics, and then again, of course, politics. But what I've learned in the last 10 years from these folks is that they really were subjected to a genocide in a very literal sense. And I don't know if that statistic shows up as much as it really happens. And just kind of curious on your comment on that.
Yeah. One thing I would like to do that we don't have yet on the art of this archive I run is I would like to show the changes in religion over time and sort of some of the forced emigrations, because that occurs much more than people might expect it to that occur, in different countries. And even since the Soviet Union has broke up, you see people are more familiar with the Jews emigrating to Israel, but there's been much more of homogenization in some of these countries, where sometimes by pressure, not only due to religion, but due to ethnicity and a variety of things along that line. In terms of when they come to the U.S., one of the things that's most common is that things are changing somewhat in the United States, but still, one of the things that often they all prize is they can form their own little enclaves, which where they can have their own their own little religious community and social community, and yet at the same time it helps them. It does two things. One is it reinforces their existing culture, but two, it helps to train them to go out into the new culture too. So you have people, the first generation learning English and trying to become citizens while they're teaching the home language and how to cook whatever they cooked in their homeland to the second generation. So yeah, there's a whole lot of stories there to tell with the immigration, and both statistically and just, I think, interpersonally.
Indeed. You have a quick question?
Thank you. I'm sort of disturbed or concerned about the stories that you are telling us about the relations between the Hindus and Muslims in India. I just want to get your view about where is this heading, and are things going to get worse? And I hope you give us a more positive, optimistic answer, because we tend to close this session.
Just the truth, just the truth. There lies the rub. And our task is to mirror what is happening. It's a true mirror which faithfully represents facts. And the facts of the matter here in India right now is pretty serious, because the majority group has now immense power. Never before in independent India, an overtly religious group has so much power of controlling the whole country. And the main agenda, not only the agenda, the raison d'etre of this party is religion at the cost of the minority group. Because they're tapping into the majority religious sentiments to capture power. Religion is nothing but a tool to capture power and to plunder the resources of the country. Essentially, it has nothing to do with religious belief, because the religion that they are promoting is not true Hinduism. So, I can't visualize the situation improving. Rather, it is going from bad to worse, as Finke has described. The latest threat is the threat of registration. The National Register. This is the only government that is promoting this. They are taking their register of citizenship. The purpose is to eliminate the minorities who have come from Bangladesh mainly, or those who didn't go to Pakistan. So it's now getting brutal. Already in the eastern part, one state of India, Assam, is now a victim of this so-called record of citizenship, because many genuine citizens of eastern India, those who fought for the country, who were in the army, they have now been excluded from the bona fide citizenship register. So it's a pretty dangerous situation. A grave danger is in store for India. I'm sorry, I can't give out any hope. It's a pretty serious situation now.
Well, thank you very much. And we please give a welcome. Thank you for all of you, each person, for contributing to this conversation. We're very grateful. Good evening.